I'm Charlie Wright of Gold Derby, and I'm talking today with Ryan White, the director of the Netflix documentary Pamela, A Love Story, as part of our Meet the Experts TV documentary panel. First thing I wanted to ask you was, were you initially skeptical of having Pamela Anderson as the subject of a documentary?
Yeah, I mean, I'll only say this because I've had this conversation with her many times now since, but my initial reaction when I was proposed to make this documentary was saying no, thank you. And I think that's because, like a lot of people, I had all of these preconceived notions about who Pamela Anderson is or who she would be today. And I wasn't really interested in being a part of that story. And then I met her. I was convinced just to have a Zoom with her. It was the height of COVID. She was living on her island in Canada, and I was in this very kitchen in Los Angeles, and I got on this Zoom with Pamela Anderson, and she just exploded every single one of those preconceived notions over the course of the conversation. And I was so fascinated with who she appeared to be in this little box in front of me. And I thought, like, wow, if I'm this surprised right now, if we could just translate this to a documentary film and show an audience who this woman really is, that could be the recipe for a great documentary. So that was sort of the genesis.
One of the things that I love that comes across in this documentary is how much she really loved, I say that because her kids are grown now, but really loved being a mother. And how much she really treasured that. Did her sons tell you anything that really surprised you about her as a mother?
Yeah, I mean, you would think that the children of Tommy Lee and Pamela Anderson would be absolutely insane children, having grown up in that circus, or the seemingly what seemed to be a circus. But what you have are two very level-headed young gentlemen, both one got sober when he was 18 and the other one has just chosen to remain sober his entire life. And meeting them, they're incredibly mature for their age. I think they're 26 and 25 now. Meeting them really chiseled away at some of those preconceived notions that I was talking about. I think most people, if you we're only watching Pamela through the lens of the media storm of the 90s, would assume that those children could be train wrecks. And instead, she raised these incredible young sons. And, as we discovered once we found Pamela's archive of, old VHS and mini DV tapes, you get to watch those boys grow up in front of your eyes. And I think much more important, Pamela's very self-deprecating and almost dismissive of her entire modeling and acting career. By far the proudest achievement of her entire life. And I would say one of the very few things that she still cares about in life are those two boys. And so I think that's a real testament to how she raised them.
One of the other things that is kind of interesting is that at the same time, I know that she very recently released a memoir, and I was curious as to whether was she writing her memoir at the same time you were filming, and did that affect your film in any way?
That's a great question, because in that initial Zoom conversation that I was referencing, Pamela told me she was writing a memoir as we speak. She was spending her years in COVID on this isolated island, writing an autobiography, and she asked me if I wanted to read a draft of it. And so of course I said yes. And so not only did she captivate me in the Zoom, but once I got that draft in my inbox and I started reading her life story, all of these things that I knew nothing, like I was starting from ground zero in my knowledge base of Pamela Anderson. So getting to read not only the amazing life story, but also her incredible storytelling style that really does shine through in that memoir. Like, you realize how incredibly smart and funny she is, and how nuanced she is in the way she sees the stories from her lifetime. That also was a huge factor in selling me on the fact that she was going to be a compelling documentary subject. And it was a huge boon for me. Typically when I'm making a documentary, I am starting at square one with these people and figuring out what stories we're going to use to constitute the total running time of a documentary. And the memoir allowed me a real blueprint for her entire life, to start sort of scripting out what moments, at least on face value, I thought we might want to include in the film and that I would want to be having, conversations with her about.
So one of the other things that I think was kind of interesting is that you, with the exception of like towards the end when you get to when you get to her going to New York to rehearse for Chicago, you when it comes to the actual like talking heads in the movie, you only really used her family. You didn't interview anybody from Baywatch or anyone or any of her friends from the time. And I was curious as to why did you only have family members as people that were interviewed for the film?
Yeah, and even then we barely interviewed the family members. I mean, I think those are a few conversations here and there that kind of happened in the moment. I mean, the vision from the beginning was to not do an interview-based film, even with Pamela herself. We never used a light in those films. We never used a huge crew. Those are just, I started calling it our white couch conversation, where we would just sit down on the same white couch every time I visited. There was no prep for those shots. It would just, she would kind of, saunter down in her Birkenstocks or Crocs from her roadhouse up at the top, land in the beach house where we were hanging out. She would plop down on the white couch and we would pick up the conversation where we left off last. And, Pamela is, she's a real creative, which I think challenges a lot of people's preconceived notions of her. Like, she's a real artistic collaborator. And so she doesn't enjoy anything that is really overly produced or forced in any way. She really likes spontaneity. She really loves unpredictability. And so we just had to learn to roll with that. And so she was totally on board with, not doing. At the beginning, she was giving me, a list of all of these people from her lifetime that I could speak to and that had told her, if a documentary is being made about you, I'm happy to participate. And I remember being nervous and telling Pamela, like, I don't think I'm going to talk to those people. Like, I don't feel a need to interview talking heads. And I was so relieved when she was like, even better. She's like, that's fine. No one will have their feelings hurt. And I was much more interested once I got to know her to see the world and see her life through her eyes versus other people's lenses on her. I think you could make a great film out of that as well, by the way. But my interest in documentary filmmaking is always to get really, really embedded in someone's life, and be along for whatever that journey is that's unfolding in their life at the time. And so, knowing you only have 90 minutes to make a film, my interest was more in only really doing it from her perspective.
One of the other you touch on this in the film because because last year we had the limited series on Hulu, the dramatization of the whole thing with the sex tape. And I was wondering if when that became known to you, did that affect your filming in any way?
Yeah, because people often think that our documentary was a reaction to that Hulu series. And as everyone knows, like, we in the industry, at least, we were pitching this documentary before that show had actually even come out. So, we were there when Pamela was sort of blindsided by this idea that a series was even going to exist, about what she sees as the worst moment of her entire life, more than a moment, an entire era from her life, chapter that was incredibly traumatic for her. And, even for me, who had gotten to know her by that point, it was a really eye-opening, humanizing trauma to watch her go through, because I cared for her by that point, but I still assumed, like, how traumatic can that be to have to relive something that was so in the public eye? It's almost what she's most famous for. And watching her agonize over knowing that series was, going to be a thing. And then while it was being made, and then especially when it came out, was really painful to get to witness. And so, you know, we were always very, Pamela was, she's a totally open book. Like there was not one moment during the entire shooting where Pamela said, I don't want to talk about that, or how are you going to use that in the film? And the only moments where she would get incredibly viscerally uncomfortable and sometimes sick to her stomach, literally, was when we would begin talking about the stolen tape. And, you know, to her credit, she knew it was something that we were going to have to take on. She knew it was something that audiences were going to be interested in. She knew audiences were going to be especially primed, knowing that the Hulu show was coming out and that it was going to be seemingly very popular, which it proved to be. And so I have to give her a lot of credit, because those were the moments that I think she really wanted to run out of that beach house whenever I would bring up the stolen tape. And she would every time just sort of try to settle those emotions and speak for it as long as she could about it. But, you know, I think that's all real. And that's important for people to see, especially about celebrities of her stature, that even when someone that famous has gone through something traumatic in the public eye, that how incredibly re-traumatizing it can be to resurface those things, and especially resurface it when that's out of that person's control.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. Wish you all the best.
Thank you so much.